The last thing Von Mercer expected was for Calder Voss to turn his back on him. He'd ridden 3 days through choking dust and August heat to find the man they called the fastest gun alive. And when he finally walked into the freight yard at Gideon Rusk's station and saw Calder hauling crates like a common laborer, sweat-soaked, silent, his famous Colt nowhere in sight, Vaughn had laughed out loud, laughed until his ribs hurt. Then he'd grabbed the nearest water bucket and hurled it across the yard, the metal clanging against the fence post 6 inches from an old man's head, just to see what Calder would do. Everyone froze. Calder didn't reach for his gun. He set down the crate he was carrying, turned slowly, and looked at Vaughn the way a man looks at weather he didn't expect but isn't surprised by. "You done?" Calder said. Vaughn spat in the dirt. "Not even close." If you've ever watched a man choose to swallow his pride instead of his last breath, you know the kind of silence that fell over that yard. Stay with me. Because this story doesn't end the way you think it does, and the man you're about to meet is not the man the legend made him out to be. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and following this story all the way to its end. You won't want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The town of Redemption Flats had been dying for years before Calder Voss ever set foot in it. You could see it in the buildings, the way the wood had gone gray and soft at the corners, the way the sign above the general store had lost 2 of its letters and nobody had bothered to replace them. The livery on the south end had burned down 18 months prior, and the lot still sat open and charred, like a missing tooth. 3 of the town's original 7 saloons had shuttered. The church had no pastor. The school had 12 children and a teacher who was thinking seriously about leaving before winter. It was the kind of place that had once believed in itself and then slowly stopped. Calder rode in on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the wind was moving through the street with that particular cruelty that only the high plains can manage. Not cold enough yet to be honest about what it was, just cold enough to get under your collar and stay there. He was 23 years old. He didn't look it. He'd had the kind of years that age a man sideways rather than forward. Not in the face exactly, but in the eyes, in the way he carried himself through a doorway, in the particular set of his jaw that said he had already decided, before he walked into any room, what he was prepared to do in it. His name was known in 11 counties, 18 kills. That was the number people quoted. Some said it was higher, and that Calder had simply stopped keeping track, which was somehow worse than if he'd kept careful count. He'd killed men for money, for pride, for contract, and twice, if the stories were accurate, for reasons that had nothing to do with either. He wasn't a lawman. I wasn't an outlaw exactly, though the line between those two things on the frontier was often just a matter of who was doing the describing. It was something older and less tidy than either category, a man who had found, at 17, that he was extraordinarily good at one specific and irreversible thing, and had spent 6 years doing it with the thoroughness of someone who had not yet found anything else worth being good at. He tied his horse outside the Black Spur Saloon and went inside. The room had maybe 14 people in it, drinkers, card players, a barkeep who looked like he'd been poured into that spot behind the counter and simply never moved. The conversation didn't stop all at once. It tapered. One voice, then another, then the scrape of a chair as someone shifted their weight, and suddenly found a reason to look at their glass instead of the door. By the time Calder reached the bar, the room was quiet enough that you could hear the oil lamp hissing. He ordered whiskey. The barkeep set it in front of him without a word and stepped back as if he'd just placed something fragile on a ledge. Calder drank it, set the glass down, didn't look around the room. He wasn't performing. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. He didn't enter rooms the way some men did, with the deliberate theater of the dangerous, the slow sweep of the eyes, the hand resting near the holster for show. He was simply present, and his presence was enough. The reputation walked in 3 seconds before he did and rearranged the furniture. He ordered a second whiskey. That was when he noticed the old man. I was sitting at a corner table, the table farthest from the door, farthest from the bar, tucked into the angle where 2 walls met, as though he'd chosen the spot that would require the most effort to reach. He had a book open in front of him, a cup of something at his elbow, and the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a pleasant afternoon and was waiting patiently for the interruption to pass. He was not looking at Calder. Every other person in that room was sneaking glances at Calder the way people watch lightning, quick, guilty, trying to track it without committing to the act of watching. This man was reading his book. Calder studied him for a moment. The man was old, somewhere in his 60s, maybe older. His hair had gone white and thin. His hands, resting on either side of the open book, were large and rope-scarred in the particular way of a man who had worked with them for many decades. He wore plain clothes. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that explained why Calder found himself pushing off from the bar and crossing the room toward him. He pulled out the chair across the table and sat down without being invited. The old man finished his sentence. Then he looked up. His eyes were the color of creek water in January, pale gray, clear, and carrying a coldness that had nothing to do with hostility. Just clarity, like a man who had looked at enough things to stop being startled by what he saw. "You're interrupting," the man said. "I know." Calder leaned forward and set both forearms on the table. "What's your name?" "Elias Crowe." The name didn't mean anything to Calder immediately. He let it sit for a moment, turning it over, looking for the edge of it. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Elias agreed. He closed the book, carefully, marking his place with a folded scrap of paper. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "I know." Elias picked up his cup and drank from it. "I used to rely on that." Calder went still. There was something in the way the old man had said it, not as a boast, not as nostalgia, just as a fact he'd filed away a long time ago and hadn't needed to take out in a while. "I used to rely on that, past tense, deliberate." "You were a gunfighter," Calder said. "I was many things." Elias set the cup down. "That was one of them." Calder studied him for another moment. Then slowly he reached down and drew his Colt. He didn't point it at Elias's face. He set the barrel on the table, angled toward the old man's chest. A gesture rather than a threat, or a threat made to look like a gesture. "People who sit in corners reading books don't usually end up in my way," he said. "So what are you doing here?" Elias looked at the gun. Then he looked at Calder. "I was here before you were," he said. "That's not what I asked." "I'm passing through, same as you." He didn't move, didn't shift in his chair, didn't look at the gun again. "I imagine you've had that thing pointed at men who begged you, men who made speeches, men who reached for their own iron and made it interesting." He paused. "I'm not going to do any of those things." "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to finish my drink," Elias said, "and then I'm going to ask you something." The room was so quiet now that Calder could hear someone breathing hard near the bar, shallow, careful, the breathing of a person trying not to exist. "Ask," Calder said. Elias looked at him for a long moment, not measuring him, something different, the way you look at something familiar in an unexpected place, recognition without surprise. "How many of them are you still carrying?" he said. Calder's jaw tightened. 18. "No." Elias shook his head just slightly. "I mean in here." He touched 2 fingers to his own sternum. Not the heart. Higher. The chest. The place where something lives before it gets heavy enough to drop into the stomach. "How many?" Calder didn't answer. The silence stretched. Elias didn't push into it. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who had asked that question of himself enough times to know what waiting for the answer felt like. "All of them," Calder said, finally. The words came out quieter than he intended. Elias nodded slowly. "I know." "Oh," he said. "That's how it works. Every one of them. You think you put them down and you walk away, but they don't stay put. They follow you. Not like ghosts, nothing that dramatic. More like debt. Interest that compounds." Calder's hand was still on the Colt. His fingers hadn't moved. "I had 26, Elias said. He said it the way a man states a weight he's measured. Took me till I was 41 to understand that I was killing myself one trigger pull at a time. Not dying, something worse. I was erasing the man I'd been. Every time I drew, there was a little less of him left." "That's a pretty speech," Calder said. His voice had gone flat. "It's not a speech." Elias met his eyes. "It's arithmetic." Calder looked at him, really looked at him, the way he hadn't looked at anyone in longer than he could name. He saw something in the old man's face that he had no word for. Not peace exactly, not regret. something more uncomfortable than either. The particular expression of a man who had learned something true about himself too late and had decided, somewhere in the aftermath, to stop pretending otherwise. His grip on the Colt loosened. He didn't holster it, not yet, but his fingers relaxed one by one, and the tension in his forearm went out of it, and he sat there with his hand resting on the gun rather than wrapped around it, which was a different thing entirely. "What did you do?" Calder said. After I stopped? Elias considered this. Made a lot of mistakes. Took a long time to learn how to be useful instead of frightening. He picked up his cup again. It's harder than it sounds. When you've only ever been one thing to people, being something else feels almost dishonest at first. Like you're pretending. Maybe you are. Maybe. Elias shrugged with one shoulder. But if you do it long enough, it stops being pretend. Calder sat with that for a moment. He picked up the Colt. He looked at it, the weight of it, the particular density of it in his hand, the way it had never once felt unfamiliar, from the very first time he'd picked one up at 15 in a river camp outside of Dalton County, with his hand still shaking and his heart going like a hammer. It had always felt like his, like it had been shaped for him specifically. That was the thing nobody told you. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like the truest version of himself he'd ever found. That was the part that frightened him. He holstered it. Then he stood up, straightened his coat, and looked down at Elias Crowe. "You don't know me," he said. "I don't need to." Elias looked up at him without moving. "I knew myself at your age. That's enough." Calder stood there for one more second. Then he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table edge and walked back to the bar. He ordered a third whiskey. His hand was not shaking. He was very careful about that. He stayed in Redemption Flats that night. Not because he had reason to, he'd had no particular destination in mind when he'd ridden in, which had been true for long enough that he'd stopped noticing. He took a room at the boarding house on the north end, a narrow space with a window that looked out over the empty livery lot, and lay on the bed with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling. He thought about what Elias had said. Every one of them. Interest that compounds. He wasn't a man who thought much about the men he'd killed. He had learned, quickly, at 17, that thinking about them was a kind of trap. You started thinking about who they were before you met them, and you ended up paralyzed, and paralysis was death, so you stopped. It became mechanical. Not cold, exactly. He wasn't cold, and he'd always known it, which was why the mechanical quality of it had been so necessary. You couldn't let yourself feel it and still do the thing, so you made a space inside yourself where you didn't feel it, and you kept that space and the rest of yourself separate, and you went on. But Elias had said in here, touching his chest, and the question had gotten under his skin in a way Calder hadn't expected, because the honest answer, the one he'd actually given, had surprised him while it was coming out. All of them. He hadn't known he was going to say that until he said it. He lay on the bed for a long time. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway, and a door open and close somewhere down the passage, and then quiet again. Outside the window, Redemption Flats was doing what dying towns did at midnight, settling into itself, the buildings making small sounds as the cold came down, a horse somewhere shifting on its feet. Calder put his arm over his eyes. He thought, for the first time in years, about who he'd been at 16 before the first time, before Dalton County and the river camp and the man whose name he'd never learned who had come at him with a knife over a stolen horse and made the decision for both of them in about 4 seconds of bad light and worse luck. He'd been a different person then. Not better, necessarily. He'd been hungry and reckless and prone to poor decisions, and the circumstances of his life had not equipped him for softness. But different. There had been a version of himself that had not yet found the thing he was extraordinary at, and that version had still had a range of possibilities in front of him. He didn't know if that version was still in there somewhere, under the 18 kills and the reputation and the years. He thought it probably wasn't. That was the part Elias hadn't said, that sometimes you go too far before you realize the direction was wrong, and turning around doesn't mean you get back to where you started. You just start from where you are, which is not the same thing. He slept badly and woke before sunrise. I was eating breakfast at the boarding house table when Vaughn Mercer rode into Redemption Flats. He heard it before he saw it. The kind of entrance that men like Vaughn had perfected. The particular performance of someone who had studied the theater of violence and decided the louder parts were the most important. The horse at a showy canter. The deliberate noise of arrival. Calder kept eating. The woman who ran the boarding house, a heavy-set woman named Doris, who had the expression of someone who had survived enough to be unimpressed by most things, appeared in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Calder with a certain flatness. "You know what that is?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Calder said. "Is it for you?" He considered the biscuit in his hand. "Probably." Doris nodded once, slowly, the way women in frontier towns nodded when they had predicted something unpleasant and weren't satisfied to be right. "I'll ask you to take it outside then," she said. "I'll take it outside," Calder said. He finished the biscuit. Then he folded his napkin, an oddly careful gesture, the kind of thing a man does when he's buying himself a moment to decide something, and stood up and went to the door. Vaughn Mercer was 28, broad through the chest, with the kind of handsomeness that had probably served him well when he was younger, and had since curdled into something harder. He wore his gun low and conspicuously. His horse was a flashy roan that he controlled with more pressure than necessary, just to demonstrate the control. He saw Calder immediately. His face did something complicated, relief and contempt and performance all moving through it at the same time. "Voss," he said, loud enough for the small cluster of people who'd appeared on the street to hear clearly. "I've been looking for you." Calder stood in the boarding house doorway. "Found me. You walked away from me in Clover Ridge last month." Vaughn's voice carried the particular injury of a man who'd been denied an audience. "In front of witnesses." "I remember." "That's not something a man walks away from." Calder looked at him. The street between them was maybe 40 feet. Doris had disappeared from behind him. He heard the soft close of the inner door. "Smart woman." "I just did," Calder said. Vaughn's jaw tightened. He'd expected, Calder could see it clearly, a different response, an escalation. The familiar choreography of this kind of thing, which had its own logic and its own sequence and its own satisfying resolution in the form of someone ending up in the dirt. He'd prepared for a fight. He hadn't prepared for this particular variety of nothing. "Then you're a coward," Vaughn said. The word landed in the street between them. Every person watching held their breath. Calder felt it move through him. That word, that particular word, shaped exactly right to find the place in a man's chest where the pride lives and make it clench. He'd spent years building a reputation that made that word impossible to say about him. It was the word you used when you wanted to make a man reach for his gun, because it left him no other option. Vaughn knew that. Everyone on that street knew it. Calder stood in the doorway. He thought about 18 men. He thought about a number that was already wrong because he'd stopped counting when it stopped helping. He thought about an old man reading a book in a corner who looked at him without flinching. "All right," Calder said. He turned and went back inside. The silence on the street lasted for 3 full seconds. Then the murmuring started, the particular murmuring of people who had witnessed something they didn't have a category for and were trying urgently to build one. Calder heard it through the boarding house wall as he sat back down at the table. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Doris appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was holding a dish towel and looking at him with the expression of a woman revising her first opinion of someone. "He's still out there," she said. "I know. He's going to say worse things." "Probably." Calder wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Let him." She stood there for another moment. Then she went back into the kitchen without saying anything further, and Calder heard the sound of dishes being washed, which was about the most normal sound in the world, and he sat with it. His hands were steady. He didn't know what he'd expected to feel, walking away from Vaughn's challenge, from that word, from the entire structure of what he'd built around himself for 6 years. He'd thought it might feel like weakness, like the absence of something important, like standing in a room and realizing the floor was just gone. It didn't feel like that. It felt like something he didn't have a name for. Not strength, not peace. Something rawer than either. The particular feeling of a man who has held his breath so long he's forgotten what breathing normally felt like, and has just, almost accidentally, exhaled. He sat in Doris's boarding house and finished his coffee. Outside, Vaughn Mercer said 3 more things that were meant to bring Calder back into the street, each one louder and more deliberately degrading than the last. Calder heard all of them. He sat still through all of them. Each one was like a match struck in his direction. He felt the heat of it, the tiny violence of it, the pull, and he let it pass. By the time Vaughn rode out of Redemption Flats, his voice had taken on the particular ragged edge of a man who had prepared for a specific kind of response and received none, and was now performing for an audience that wasn't sure what it had seen. Calder set his empty cup down. He thought of Elias Crowe in the corner with his book. He thought, I used to rely on that. And then he thought, with the exhausted clarity of a man who has just done something irreversible, so did I. He sat at the table for a while longer. He was not sure what came next. He was not sure what anything looked like from here. The life he had built was built on one specific thing, and he had, in the space of approximately 18 hours and 1 cup of lukewarm coffee, stepped away from it. He didn't know who he was going to be, but he knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't require understanding, that the version of himself that had walked into this town yesterday was not the version he was willing to keep being. That was enough. For now, that was enough. He put on his hat and went to find work. He found work the same afternoon he decided to look for it, which was either good luck or the universe being efficient about something for once. The freight station sat 2 miles east of Redemption Flats on the road that connected 3 smaller settlements to the larger supply depot at Harlan Junction. It wasn't much to look at. A main building that served as office and storage combined, 2 large outbuildings for goods in transit, a corral that needed one of its fence rails replaced, and a wagon yard that always had at least 4 vehicles in various states of use or repair. The sign above the main door said Rusk Freight and Transport. In letters that had once been painted carefully and were now faded to the particular shade of a thing that has survived more seasons than it expected to. Calder rode in without an introduction and asked the first person he saw, a wiry young man wrestling a crate off a wagon bed, whether they were hiring. The young man squinted at him. You know how to drive a team? Yes. You know how to load without busting the axle? Yes. You got references? Calder looked at him. No. The young man seemed to weigh this. Then he jerked his head toward the main building. Ask Rusk. He's the one who says yes or no. I just unload things. Gideon Rusk was 54 years old, built like a man who had spent most of those years moving heavy things from one place to another, and he had the face of someone who'd heard most of the stories people told and had stopped being impressed by them a long time ago. He was standing at the counter inside the main building going over a ledger when Calder came in, and he looked up with the expression of a man who could tell the difference between a customer and someone asking for something else. You're Voss, Gideon said. Calder stopped just inside the door. News travels. Small territory. Gideon closed the ledger. He didn't step back, didn't reach for anything, just looked at Calder with that flat, measuring look. Heard you were in town. Heard what happened this morning with Mercer. Then you know how it ended. I know how it looked. Gideon's voice was careful, the way a man's voice gets when he's choosing words, the way he'd choose which boards to walk on in a building he wasn't sure about. What are you looking for? Work, Calder said. Actual work. Loading, driving, whatever you need. Gideon studied him for a long moment. I run a freight operation. I got contracts to keep. I got clients who need their goods to arrive and who don't want trouble following behind the wagon. I understand. Do you? It wasn't a question exactly, more of a probe. I'm not looking for trouble, Calder said. I'm looking for something I can do with my hands that doesn't... He stopped, tried again. I'm looking for different work. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not softness. Gideon Rusk didn't appear to be a man who did softness, but a slight easing, the way a door doesn't open but stops being so firmly closed. It's hard work, he said. Early starts, loading in the cold. Not glamorous. Good. Gideon looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then he said, 20 cents a day to start. We'll see how it goes from there. That's fair? Fair, Calder said. He started the next morning. The first week was brutal in the way that honest physical labor is brutal when you haven't done it in years. Not violent, not dramatic, just a slow accumulation of aches that settled into his shoulders and lower back and hands with the persistence of an argument that didn't resolve overnight. He'd done hard work before, in the years before his reputation built itself into something that made hard work unnecessary. But there was a particular muscle memory to freight work, the way you had to read a load before you lifted it, the way you balanced weight across a wagon bed so the axle sat right, the way you managed a 4-horse team over rutted roads without burning them out before the 3rd mile. and he had to rebuild all of it from the ground up. He didn't complain. He wasn't sure he remembered how. The other men at the station watched him with the careful, sideways attention of people who had been told something about a man and were now trying to reconcile the story with the person doing unglamorous work in their yard. They weren't unfriendly. They weren't exactly warm either. There was a period, about 10 days long, where every conversation he had was short and businesslike, where nobody offered him extra coffee or moved their tools to make space, where he existed at the station the way a new piece of furniture does, present, probably permanent, but not yet part of the room. He understood it. He'd given people reasons to be cautious, and reasons didn't disappear because the behavior had. He kept his head down. He did the work. He ate his lunch in the yard because the table inside was crowded and he didn't want to make anyone shift over. And he spent those 30 minutes in the particular internal quiet of a man who is learning to exist in a new shape. He thought about Elias Crowe occasionally. Not obsessively. He wasn't built for obsession. He didn't think, which was the one trait that had probably saved him. But the old man's words had the quality of a stone in a boot. Small, not catastrophic, but consistently present in a way that made it impossible to forget entirely. Every one of them. That's how it works. He'd been right about the arithmetic. Calder could feel it, in the quiet hours. The weight of 18, each one distinct in its specifics, none of them fading the way he'd been told they would. He kept working. By the third week, one of the other men, a big, slow-talking fellow named Hector, who seemed to assess people primarily by their willingness to do the undesirable jobs without being asked, handed him a cup of coffee one morning without being asked. It was a small thing. Calder accepted it without making anything of it, because making something of it would have been wrong, and because he was beginning to understand that this was what belonging to a place looked like. Not a moment, but an accumulation of small things offered and accepted without ceremony. That was when he first spoke more than 4 sentences to Mara Rusk. She had been there from the beginning, of course. She ran the books and handled the contracts and coordinated the dispatch schedule from a small desk in the back corner of the main building, and she was clearly the reason the operation ran as smoothly as it did, though nobody said so directly, including her. She was 27, with the kind of dark-eyed directness that registered immediately and the kind of intelligence that revealed itself gradually, in the specific precision of her words and the way she noticed things before other people did. She had noticed Calder on day 1. She hadn't done anything about it except note it and continue working, which was, he would later understand, characteristic of her. Mara Rusk processed information carefully and then made decisions. She did not react to things. She responded to them, which was a different thing, and the gap between those two behaviors was where most of her competence lived. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday morning in early November when she came out to the yard with a problem. One of the station's regular clients, a dry goods supplier named Holcomb, had sent a message demanding an expedited delivery to the Parsley Creek settlement, which was 52 miles over a road that got genuinely difficult after the first rains. The issue was that the team they usually ran that route was short a horse. One of them had thrown a shoe and pulled up lame, and nobody had figured out the load distribution for a 3-horse team on that grade. Calder was the only one in the yard at that moment, repairing harness leather at the fence. Mara came out with the manifest in her hand and stopped 6 feet from him. "You've driven the Parsley Creek Road?" she said. No preamble. He looked up. "Once. 2 years ago." "With what team?" 4 horses. Lighter load than this." He nodded at the manifest. "Can it be done with 3?" He looked at the numbers she showed him. He thought about the grade at the second crossing and the condition of the road after rain and the specific way a 3-horse hitch behaved under uneven load on a downhill pitch, which was a collection of variables he hadn't needed to hold in his head for a long time, but found, somewhat to his surprise, that he still could. "If you redistribute the load and don't try to make time on the descent," he said, "and if the rain holds off." "It won't hold off," she said. "Then add a quarter day to the delivery window and tell Holcomb the road conditions are a constraint. He won't like that." "He cannot like it from his dry office in town," Calder said. "The alternative is losing a horse or the whole load." She looked at him for a moment. Not the careful sideways look the men had been giving him. Direct, assessing, the look of someone running a fast internal calculation. "You ever run freight before?" "A long time ago." "Before the other thing?" He met her eyes. "Yes." She didn't look away. My father made a decision about you, she said. I don't always agree with his decisions, but I agreed with that one. She paused. Don't make me regret it. I'll try not to, he said. It wasn't a promise, and they both knew it, and the fact that he didn't dress it up as one seemed to land well with her because she gave a single small nod and went back inside. That was the beginning of it. Over the following weeks, they built something that neither of them was prepared to call what it was. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. She asked his opinion on route logistics when the question was genuinely difficult. He gave his opinion without the particular flourish men sometimes put on their opinions when they're trying to impress a woman. She caught an error in the Harlan Junction billing that saved the station $40 in overcharges and mentioned it once, briefly, to her father, who nodded and went on to the next thing. Calder watched this transaction from across the room and thought, she's been doing this a long time and getting a fraction of the credit. He didn't say so. It wasn't his business yet. But he noted it. The cold deepened in November. The work didn't stop. Freight didn't stop moving because the weather got unpleasant. It just got harder and wetter and colder. And the men at the station developed the particular wordless solidarity of people who are all equally miserable and have decided to manage it by not discussing it. Calder drove the difficult routes because he was good at them and because he didn't mind the isolation of the road in the way some men did. He spent hours in the wagon box with nothing but a team and his thoughts and the landscape moving past, and he found that he was not peaceful, not exactly, that was too clean a word, but quieter than he'd been in years. The 18 didn't go away. He'd stopped expecting them to. What changed was that he stopped bracing against them. They were part of what he was carrying, and he was carrying them forward, and at some point on a road outside Redemption Flats. In the November cold, he made a decision that was less a decision than an acceptance, that the weight was permanent, and that permanent wasn't the same as defeating. He came back from a Parsley Creek run on a Thursday afternoon to find the yard empty except for Mara, who was standing outside the main building with her arms crossed and an expression that was working very hard to be neutral. What happened? He said, because her version of neutral meant something was wrong. Nothing yet, she said. He climbed down from the wagon box. Mara. She looked at him with the particular frustration of someone who has been maintaining composure and is reaching the limit of it. Holcomb came in person today, she said. He was unpleasant. What kind of unpleasant? The kind that says things about whether a business run by a woman and her father is the kind of business serious men ought to trust. She said it flatly, without inflection, the way you describe weather when you've decided not to let it affect your plans. But her jaw was set in a way that told him the flatness was doing a lot of work. Calder looked at her for a moment. What did your father say? He told Holcomb to direct his concerns to me, since I'm the one who runs the contracts. A small, grim pause. Holcomb did not enjoy that. But he left. He left. Then you handled it. I handle it every time. Her voice had an edge in it now, not at him, but present. I've been handling it for 4 years, and it doesn't stop needing to be handled. He understood what she wasn't saying. Not that she was asking for sympathy. She wasn't that kind of person. But she'd said it out loud, which meant the composure had found its limit, and the fact that she'd said it to him, rather than walking back inside and managing it alone in the way she managed. Most things alone meant something that he wasn't going to examine too closely right now. Next time he comes in, Calder said, I'll be in the yard. She looked at him sharply. I know you don't need it, he said, but Holcomb strikes me as the kind of man who adjusts his behavior based on who's watching. I'll just be in the yard. She was quiet for a moment. You're saying you'll stand around and look threatening. I'm saying I'll be in the yard doing my job, he said. If he happens to see me and decide to be less unpleasant, that's his decision. The edge of something moved through her expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the thing that lives just behind a smile when a person is trying to decide if the situation warrants it. You don't even have your gun on you most days, she said. I know, he said. Turns out you don't need it. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went back inside. He unhitched the team and put them up for the night, working in the cold with his hands going numb and his breath visible in the air, and he thought about the fact that he'd been at this station for 6 weeks and hadn't once reached for the Colt that was currently sitting in the bottom of his saddlebag under the bed at his rented room in town. 6 weeks was not a long time. He was not under any illusions about what it meant or what it didn't mean, but it was longer than he'd managed before. December came in hard. The roads got bad, and 2 of the station's contracts slowed to minimum deliveries, which meant the cash flow tightened and Gideon started making the particular calculations that men who run small businesses make in lean months. Which expenses were essential, which could be delayed, which horses were earning their feed, and which were marginal. He didn't talk about it much, but the ledger on the desk in the main building told its own story to anyone who knew how to read numbers, and Calder had spent enough time watching Mara work the books that he knew the shape of it. He came to Gideon directly one morning. "I'll take a lower rate through January," he said, "if it helps." Gideon looked up from what he was doing. His expression was hard to read, surprise maybe, or the kind of caution that forms around generosity when you're not sure what it's going to cost you later. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'd rather be here at a lower rate than somewhere else at full wage," Calder said. It was a simple answer. It was also the most honest thing he'd said to Gideon, maybe to anyone, in a while. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That's not a conversation I need to have with you right now. We're managing." "All right," Calder said. "But I heard you say it," Gideon added, "and I'll remember it." He went back to the yard. He hadn't made the offer to build credit with Gideon, though he understood that was what it would look like, and probably what it would become. He'd made it because he meant it. Because the station had given him something, not just wages, not just occupation, but a structure in which he was useful in a way that didn't require him to be frightening. And he'd been useful without thinking about it, which was different from the grinding self-consciousness of the first weeks. And he was starting to understand that this was what Elias had meant. Not that you'd stop pretending and suddenly feel real, but that at some point the pretending would thin out and what was underneath it, whatever was left of the man who existed before the other thing, would start to take up space again. He wasn't there yet, but he could see the direction. Now, it was Hector who told him Vaughn Mercer was back. He said it the way Hector said most things, straightforwardly, without preamble, wiping axle grease from his hands with a rag that wasn't going to accomplish much. "Mercer's in town," he said. "Heard it from the supply run this morning. He's at the Black Spur." Calder kept doing what he was doing, which was mending a break in the corral fence. "How long's he been there?" 2 days, sounds like." Hector looked at him sideways. "He's been asking about you." "What kind of asking?" "The kind that's not really a question." Hector paused. "He's telling people you ran from him in October, saying the famous Calder Voss turned yellow and went to haul freight for a living." Calder drove a nail. The fence post absorbed it. "The men in town who've been watching you work here for 2 months, Hector said carefully. "They're not saying the same thing he's saying, but Mercer's louder. He usually is." Hector was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. "He's going to come out here," he said finally. "That's what it sounds like. He's not going to let this go." Calder drove another nail. "I know," he said. He'd known it was coming. Not because Vaughn Mercer was exceptional. He wasn't. He was a specific type that Calder had encountered many times. The man who measured himself against other men's reputations because he didn't trust his own, but because the frontier was a small place, and unfinished business had a way of following you at about the pace of a determined horse. The question wasn't whether Vaughn was coming. The question was what Calder was going to do about it. He drove the last nail into the fence rail and stepped back and tested the repair with both hands, pressing and pulling until he was satisfied it would hold. Then he picked up his tools and put them away and went to find something else that needed fixing. He didn't go to town that evening. He didn't sleep particularly well. Vaughn arrived on a Thursday, mid-morning, with 2 men Calder didn't recognize riding behind him, the kind of detail that was either territorial display or insurance, and with men like Vaughn, it was usually both. He came into the freight yard at a deliberate pace, choosing the moment, reading the audience. There were 4 men working in the yard, including Calder, and Mara was in the main building with the door propped open to the mild morning air. He reined in 20 feet from Calder and looked down at him. "There you are," Vaughn said. "Working man." Calder set down the harness he'd been repairing. He didn't stand up to his full height right away. He finished what he was doing first, which was a small and deliberate refusal of the scene Vaughn was trying to set, and he felt rather than saw the slight tightening around Vaughn's eyes at the delay. Then he stood. "Mercer," he said. 2 months, Vaughn said. "You've been hiding in a freight yard for 2 months." "Working," Calder said. "There's a difference." Not from where I'm sitting, Vaughn's voice was performing for the men behind him and anyone else in range. I told people in 4 counties that Calder Voss walked away from me, that the famous gunfighter couldn't handle a challenge from a real man. You know what they said? Calder waited. They laughed, Vaughn said. They laughed, and they said they didn't believe it, because the Calder Voss they knew didn't run. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. So I decided to come here myself and give you one more chance to prove them right. From the corner of his vision, Calder could see Hector and the other men in the yard had stopped moving. He could see Mara had appeared in the doorway of the main building, not coming out, just present, watching. I'm not going to draw on you, Calder said. Then I'll call you what you are in front of every man here, Vaughn said. The pleasantness was going out of his voice now, replaced by something harder and more personal. I'll call you a coward and a fraud. I'll tell people the man with 18 kills turned into a freight hauler who's too scared to defend himself. And I'll keep saying it everywhere I go until there isn't a settlement from here to the Dakota line that doesn't know the name of what you became. The yard was absolutely silent. Calder could feel the weight of it, the familiar weight of a moment that was structured to have only one outcome, built to give a man no room, designed by someone who understood the mechanics of pride and had assembled this particular situation the way you'd set a trap, carefully, leaving no obvious exit, making the bait impossible to resist. He thought about Elias Crowe's hands on either side of a book. He thought about 18 names. He thought about the fence post he'd repaired 2 days ago, solid now, the way a thing you work on with your hands can be solid and stay solid, and you can look at it tomorrow and it will still be there. He turned his back on Vaughn Mercer. The gasp that came from the yard, not loud, more like a collective intake of breath, the sound of people recalibrating what they were watching, was almost physical. He walked toward the main building. Behind him, he heard the sound he'd been listening for without knowing he was listening for it. The particular sound of a revolver clearing leather, the specific noise of a man who has run out of other options and is reaching for the one thing left. He didn't flinch. He didn't speed up. He walked at the same pace, placing his feet the same way. Time did something strange. It always did in moments like this. Stretched, became granular, each second thick with its own separate weight. He heard his own boots on the packed earth. He heard Hector somewhere to his left, very still. He heard the men behind Vaughn make small shifting sounds, uncertain. He reached the door. He put his hand on the door frame. He did not hear a gunshot. He stood there for one moment, his back still to the yard, his hand on the frame, breathing. And then he stepped inside. Mara was pressed back against the counter with both hands flat on the wood and her eyes wide and fixed on the doorway behind him. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that neither of them put words to, because the moment was too dense for words, because some things communicate themselves faster than language. "Close the door," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands on the counter were shaking. He turned and closed the door. Outside, after a long silence, he heard hoofbeats. 2 sets, then 3. Moving away. Vaughn Mercer had ridden out. Calder stood inside the building with the closed door behind him and his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Not fear, not relief exactly, something that combined both with something older and harder and more honest than either. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum, once, the way you do when something in there needs a second to settle. Mara had not moved from the counter. "You knew he might shoot you," she said. "Yes." "And you turned your back anyway?" "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Possibly both," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she pushed off the counter and walked past him to the door and opened it to look out at the empty yard where Hector and the other men were moving again, slowly, the way people resume motion after a shock. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her back to Calder, and he could see the tension in her shoulders working its way down, inch by inch, the slow release of something she'd been holding since Vaughn rode in. "He'll come back, she said. "Maybe," Calder said. "Or maybe he won't. Men like that. When the thing they came for doesn't happen, sometimes they lose interest. Sometimes they need the fight more than the win." She turned and looked at him from the doorway. "And if he doesn't lose interest?" Calder thought about it honestly. "Then we'll deal with it when it comes." The "we" was not deliberate. It came out naturally, the way words do when a thing has already shifted somewhere beneath the level of conscious decision. He heard it after it was out, and so did she, and neither of them said anything about it. She went back to her desk. He went back to the yard. Hector handed him a cup of coffee without being asked or saying anything, and Calder took it and stood in the cold morning and looked at the fence line and drank it. The coffee was too strong. He drank it anyway. By afternoon, the story had spread through Redemption Flats and the surrounding settlements the way stories moved on the frontier, fast, imprecise, already acquiring details that hadn't been there in the original. By evening, the version circulating at the Black Spur had Calder facing Vaughn down with a shovel in his hand. By the following morning, another version had him talking Vaughn out of drawing by the sheer weight of his reputation. None of the versions got it right, because the versions that got it right weren't the kind of story that traveled well. The real version, a man turned his back and walked away and didn't die, was too quiet to hold its shape in the retelling. It needed drama to survive, and the drama required a gun or a speech or a triumph of some conventional kind. What had actually happened was quieter and older and harder to categorize, and Calder had no interest in correcting the record. He had a fence to finish and a team to feed and a set of books to review with Mara on Friday morning, and those things were real and immediate and his, and they were enough. The story Vaughn Mercer carried out of Redemption Flats was not the story of a man who'd backed down. That was the thing about the Frontier's version of events. The truth had to compete with what people wanted the truth to be, and what people wanted was always more dramatic than what had actually happened. Calder understood this. He'd watched his own reputation build itself out of incidents that had been simpler and uglier and more accidental than the versions that circulated. A man became a legend not through what he did, but through what people needed him to have done, and the needs were always larger than the facts. So the story that traveled was this. Vaughn Mercer had ridden to the Rusk Freight station, confronted Calder Voss, and Calder had refused the challenge, again. And depending on who was telling it, that refusal meant one of two things. Either Calder had finally broken, the famous gun gone soft and frightened, the reputation caving under its own weight, or something stranger was happening, something people didn't quite have language for, a man choosing a different kind of argument and winning it by a method nobody had seen used before. Neither version was exactly right, but the second one was closer. Calder didn't hear most of the talk. He was working. January settled in with a cold that had genuine conviction to it. Not the teasing cold of November, but the real thing, the kind that cracked wheel rims and froze water troughs before dawn and made the horses bad-tempered in the mornings. The freight runs didn't stop. They just got harder and slower and required more from the men who made them, and Calder found that he was better suited to this version of the work than the easier autumn version had been. He wasn't sure why. Something about the difficulty making it simpler. When conditions were genuinely bad, there was no mental space for anything except the road in front of you and the team and the load. And that kind of forced simplicity was, he was discovering, something he needed. He needed to not think. Not all the time, not permanently, but in long stretches, in the physical rhythm of difficult work. He needed the particular mercy of a mind too occupied to circle back. The 18 were still there. They were always there. But they'd shifted, become less like an accusation and more like a fact of the landscape. Present, heavy, not going anywhere, but no longer the thing directly in front of him every moment. He thought that was probably as much as he could ask for. Boki. The Friday book reviews had become a regular arrangement without either of them formally deciding so. It had started practically. Mara had a question about the manifest discrepancy on the Harlan Junction run. Calder had been the one who'd driven it. They'd gone over the numbers together and found the error in 20 minutes. The following Friday, she'd had another question. The Friday after that, he'd come in without being asked because there was a route decision to make, and he had an opinion about it, and she'd nodded when she saw him come through the door and moved the spare chair to the side of the desk without comment. They were not particularly careful with each other, which was one of the things he'd come to value about it. She didn't manage him, didn't soften questions or approach subjects at angles. When she thought he was wrong, she said so, directly, without the apologetic framing that some people used when disagreeing with a man they weren't sure about. He'd been wrong twice about route decisions and right 4 times, which she tracked accurately and without sentiment, and the accuracy was one of the things he liked best about her. She didn't manufacture credit where it wasn't owed, and she didn't withhold it when it was. On a Friday in mid-January, she was going over the month's numbers, and the expression on her face told him, before she said anything, that the news was not good. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough." She turned the ledger so he could see the column. Holcomb pulled 2 contracts. Calder looked at the numbers. "Because of December?" "Because of me," she said, with a flatness that was different from her usual flatness. This one had a history behind it, something she'd been carrying for a while. "He told my father he wasn't comfortable with how the operation was being managed. What he meant was that he isn't comfortable with who's managing it." "Your father knows that's what he meant?" "My father knows exactly what he meant." A pause. He also told Holcomb that if he had concerns about the management, he could take them somewhere else, which is what Holcomb did. She closed the ledger. "So now we have 2 fewer contracts and a January that's already thin." Calder was quiet for a moment. "What's the gap?" She named the figure. He did the arithmetic in his head. "That's coverable," he said, "if we pick up a new contract before March." "Yes?" she said. "I know that. I've been writing letters for 3 weeks. She rubbed the side of her face with one hand, a small tired gesture he'd seen her make a few times. The gesture of a person who is maintaining composure and is very aware of the energy it costs. "The problem isn't the numbers. The numbers I can manage. The problem is that Holcomb is talking. He's telling people that this operation isn't well run, and the people he's telling have money and contracts, and they listen to him because he's been in this territory longer than we have." "Your father's been here 12 years, Calder said. "Holcomb's been here 22. She looked at him. "And Holcomb doesn't think I count." It was the most direct she'd been about it, the whole of it, not just the immediate problem, but the underlying structure of it, the way her competence was perpetually discounted by the specific category she'd been put in by men who hadn't looked past the category. He'd watched it happen in small ways over the months. The client who addressed questions to Gideon that Mara had already answered. The contractor who rewrote terms they'd agreed on with her as though the agreement needed male ratification. The particular exhaustion of having to prove the same things repeatedly to people who forgot the proof between meetings. "I'll go with you to the next client meeting," he said. She looked at him with the same sharp attention she'd given him when he'd said the same basic thing about Holcomb in October. "I told you then." "I know," he said. "You don't need it. But Holcomb's been talking, and the men Holcomb talks to are going to have a version of me in their heads that's either the fastest gun alive or a freight hauler who went soft. Either way, my showing up in a room changes what they're looking at." He paused. "You use what's available. That's logistics." She considered this for a long moment, the way she considered most things, not impulsively, not with resistance, but with the genuine attention of someone deciding whether an argument held. "You're saying your presence is a resource," she said. "I'm saying it's a fact about the room that might be useful. And if they want to talk to you instead of me, then I'll tell them the route decisions are yours, and the contracts are yours, and the operation runs because of you, and if they want to continue doing business with Rusk Freight. They should get comfortable directing their questions to the woman who runs it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You'd actually say that," she said. "Not quite a question." "Yes." Something moved through her expression that she didn't try to name and he didn't try to read. She turned back to the ledger. "The Patterson brothers out of Clover Ridge," she said. "They have a supply contract that's been running through a competitor who's been unreliable. I've written twice. I have a meeting with them next Thursday." "I'll be there," Calder said. She didn't argue. "What?" The Patterson meeting went better than either of them had expected and worse than Calder had hoped, which was about the honest range of how things went. The Patterson brothers were 2 men, Ned, who was 50 and practical, and Roy, who was 44 and suspicious of most things by disposition, and they spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting directing questions at Calder that Mara had already answered in writing. Calder answered them the same way every time. "That's a contract question? Mara can speak to that better than I can." "That's a route question. Mara laid that out in the letter she sent you last week." "That's a rate question. What did she quote you?" Ned Patterson adjusted faster than his brother. By the third redirect, he was looking at Mara when he spoke. Roy took longer, about 40 minutes, which was honest. But eventually the quality of her answers pulled his attention to where it needed to be, because Roy was suspicious of most things, but he was also, underneath it, practical, and practical men eventually follow competence when they have enough rope to find it. They left with a provisional agreement to trial a 6-week contract beginning in February. On the road back to the station, Mara sat in the wagon box beside Calder and looked at the middle distance for a while without speaking. "Roy Patterson is going to be annoying for at least the first 3 runs," she said finally. "Probably," Calder agreed. "He'll second-guess the manifest and he'll want to talk to you about route decisions even after I've already made them. I'll keep redirecting." She was quiet for another stretch of road. The cold was sharp and clean, and the sky had the pale, particular quality of a clear January afternoon, all light, no warmth. "You're good at that," she said finally. "The redirecting. It doesn't look like redirecting. It looks like you just don't know the answer." "I don't know the answer to those questions," he said. "You do. That's the whole point." She looked at him sideways. "You know more than you let on." "I know enough to know who knows more." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's not a small thing." She turned back to the middle distance. "No," she said after a moment. "It's not." They picked up 2 more smaller contracts before February arrived, which brought the station back to something closer to stable. Though stable on the frontier always meant something more conditional than the word implied. Stable meant not currently failing, not secured against the next hard season. Gideon noticed the change in the books without asking how it happened, which was his way. He was a man who gathered information through proximity and patience rather than direct inquiry, and he'd been watching Calder and Mara work together for long enough to have an opinion about it that he kept carefully to himself, because Gideon Rusk had made a career of not saying things before it was time. He did say one thing. In early February, on a morning when Calder had come in before the rest of the crew and was drinking coffee alone at the work table, Gideon came through with his coat on, clearly heading out on something, and stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "You're good for this place," Gideon said. No preamble. Calder looked up. "I mean the work," Gideon said, "and other things." He paused in the way of a man who has rehearsed a version of something and is delivering an abbreviated edition. "I don't give that kind of assessment lightly." "I know," Calder said. "Good." Gideon put his hat on and went out. It was possibly the most significant conversation Calder had had with the man in 4 months, and it lasted about 30 seconds, and both of them understood exactly what had been said and what hadn't. I went back to Redemption Flats on a Sunday afternoon in late February for the first time since he'd found work at the station. Not for any particular reason. He needed to pick up a package at the general store that had arrived on the supply wagon, and he needed a new pair of work gloves because his had worn through at the fingers. And he told himself these were sufficient reasons, and that the other reason, the one that had been sitting quietly at the back of his mind for weeks, wasn't the real reason. He saw Elias Crowe's horse outside the Black Spur before he saw anything else. He recognized it immediately, a particular gray with a distinctive blaze on the forehead, the kind of horse that stayed in the memory. He stood in the street for a moment and looked at it, and then he went inside. Elias was in the same corner. Different book. Or possibly the same book, significantly further along. He looked up when Calder came in, and the expression on his face was precisely the same as it had been in October. Unhurried, clear, carrying no particular surprise. "You're still here," Calder said, sitting down across from him. "I pass through regularly," Elias said. He set the book down. "I heard things have been different." "Different from what?" "From before." He looked at Calder the way he'd looked at him in October, the recognition without surprise, the clarity that was neither cold nor warm but simply present. "You look different. It's been 4 months." "It's not time," Elias said. "It's something else." He studied him for a moment. "You found something to do." "I found work," Calder said. "That's what I said." Calder was quiet. He looked at his hands on the table, the new calluses layered over the old ones, the different distribution of them. Work calluses, rather than the other kind. "Mercer came," he said. "I heard." I turned my back on him. He had his gun out. Elias was quiet for a moment. And he didn't shoot." "No," Elias said. "He wouldn't." "You knew that." "I suspected it." Elias picked up his cup. "Men like Mercer need the fight more than the winning. If there's no fight, there's no story. He couldn't shoot a man walking away, not because of conscience, but because it wouldn't give him what he came for." He set the cup down. "You read that correctly, even if you didn't know you were reading it." Calder turned that over. He'd thought about the moment many times since it happened, not with pride, not exactly, but with a kind of repeated examination, the way you press on a bruise to see if it's healed. Each time he pressed on it, the answer was the same. I turned around and I kept walking, and I didn't die, and I didn't reach for the gun, and both those things were true at the same time. He still didn't have clean language for what that meant. Elias, he said. Abner Crowe. Something shifted in the old man's face. Slight, but present. Is he a relation of yours? Calder said. The silence lasted just a beat too long. He was my brother, Elias said. Calder watched him. Was. He died 3 years ago. Elias said it with the particular flatness of someone who has been saying a thing long enough to have stripped most of the feeling from the surface of it, but not from whatever lives below the surface. In Harlan Junction, he had a land office there. Legitimate operation. He'd been running it for years. How did he die? That's a question I've been living with for 3 years. Elias looked at his cup. The official finding was a robbery. Someone came into the office after hours and killed him, took the cash from the lockbox. But you don't think it was a robbery? The cash was there when they found him, Elias said quietly. Whoever killed him wasn't after money. They were after something in the files. Calder was still. I looked into it as much as I could, Elias said. A man my age, without any official standing, there's a limit to what you can find. But I know Abner's files were gone through. I know certain records were missing. And I know that the man who'd been working for him for 2 years, a man named Silas Vane, left Harlan Junction 3 days after Abner died and didn't tell anyone where he was going. Did you find Vane? Elias looked at him directly. Yes. Calder waited. I found him, Elias said. He said nothing further about what that meant. His hands on the table were very still. But I couldn't prove what he'd done. And I made a decision, maybe the wrong one, I've wondered about it since, to keep what I knew quiet, because the proof I had wasn't the kind that would hold in front of a marshal, and because I was... He stopped. I was not in a state to handle it well, and I made it worse. How? That's a longer conversation than I'm ready to have today, Elias said. He looked at Calder with the same directness he'd carried from the beginning, but there was something behind it now, a weight that the October version of him hadn't shown, or that Calder hadn't been in a position to see then. There are things connected to Abner's death that I need to set right. I've been putting it off for reasons that made sense at the time and make less sense now. Calder looked at him for a long moment. Does it connect to me? He said. Elias was quiet. Elias. Not yet, the old man said, but I think it might. And if it does... He paused. I want you to know that if that day comes, I'll tell you everything, all of it, the parts that don't reflect well on me included. Calder studied him. Why tell me this now? Because you're not the man you were in October, Elias said simply. And because whatever's coming, if it comes, you should have time to decide what you want to do about it. He picked up his book. The conversation was over, or at least that portion of it was, the portion Elias was willing to open right now, and Calder understood enough about the man to know that pushing wouldn't open anything that wasn't ready to open. He sat with it for a minute. Then he said, Are you going to be in town long? Few more days, Elias said. Come out to the station, Calder said. Eat a proper meal. The boarding house food here hasn't improved. Something that was genuinely close to a smile moved through Elias's face. I remember. Wednesday, Calder said. He left the old man with his book and went to get his gloves and his package from the general store, and he rode back to the station with the conversation sitting in his chest, the way new information does when it's not yet connected to enough other things to have its proper shape. Present, significant, waiting for the context that would tell him what it actually meant. March came in easier than February and then got difficult again, the way the frontier seasons always disappointed you right when you'd started to trust them. One of the station's horses, a big bay that had been the workhorse of the Parsley Creek team, went lame with something that the farrier couldn't fully fix and might never fully fix, which meant a gap in pulling capacity at exactly the time the spring contract volume was picking up. Gideon made arrangements to lease a horse from a rancher outside town, which helped but was a recurring expense he hadn't budgeted for, and the arithmetic of it showed in his face when he thought nobody was looking. Calder and Mara were going over the spring schedule on a Friday afternoon when she set her pencil down and looked at him. "There's a larger contract we've been circling around," she said. "Kendrick Timber. They move lumber from the mill at Sycamore Fork to 3 settlements. Whoever has that contract runs steady volume from April through October." "I've heard of it," he said. "Who has it now?" "Doyle Transport out of Harlan Junction." She said the name with a particular neutrality. "They've had it for 2 years, but Kendrick's been unhappy. Delivery windows have been inconsistent. He's been late twice on construction commitments. So he's looking." "He's listening," she corrected. "There's a difference." She picked up the pencil again and turned it in her fingers. "The problem is scale. Kendrick would require 2 dedicated wagons and 4 horses minimum for the peak months. We're short on both. If the contract came through, could your father get the capital to expand?" "He could get a loan," she said. "He's done it before. But a loan against a new contract that hasn't been proven is a risk." "Everything's a risk," Calder said, "not the same risk." She looked at him steadily. "I've watched him take on debt he couldn't service before I was running the books. It nearly took the whole operation." She paused. "I won't let that happen again." He understood then the full shape of why she worked the numbers the way she did, why she was precise to the point of severity about the contracts and the margins and the routes. It wasn't an abstract preference for accuracy. It was the specific caution of a person who'd watched a thing come very close to breaking and had spent years since then making sure it wouldn't. "What would make the risk acceptable?" he said. She thought about it seriously. "A signed letter of intent from Kendrick before we take on the debt. Something binding enough that a bank would count it as collateral." She paused. "And a driver who could manage the Sycamore Fork route reliably. It's not a simple road." "I know that road," Calder said. She looked at him. "I ran a supply contract through Sycamore Fork years ago," he said. "Before." He let the before stand without explaining it, which he no longer felt the need to do, and she accepted it without asking, which was one of the things about her that had become important to him in a way he hadn't tried to define. "I can run it. And I think we should go see Kendrick." She was quiet for a long moment, turning the pencil. Then, "I'll write to him Monday." "Write to him today," Calder said. "He's listening. That's not the same as waiting." She held his eyes for a second, then she put the pencil to paper. Elias came to the station on Wednesday as invited. He ate dinner with Gideon and Calder and Mara at the work table that served as the station's meal table when the weather kept them inside, and he was, Calder noted, with some private relief, good with Gideon. Not ingratiating, not performing. He listened more than he talked, and when he talked he was direct in a way that Gideon respected, because Gideon had no patience for people who orbited a point without landing on it. Mara watched Elias the way she watched most new things, carefully, without telegraphing her conclusions, waiting for more data before she assembled an opinion. After dinner, Gideon went to do the evening rounds and Mara went to finish a letter, and Calder and Elias sat with their coffee in the quiet of the main building. "She runs this place," Elias said. It was an observation, not a question. "Yes," Calder said, "and Gideon knows it." "He does." Elias nodded slowly. He was looking at Calder with the particular attention he'd given him from the first night in October, that clarity, that recognition. "You've changed your shape," he said. "Not who you are. Your shape." "I don't know what I am yet," Calder said honestly. "That's fine," Elias said. "Most people who think they know are wrong anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "Calder, about what I told you in town." "I'm listening." Elias set his cup down and looked at his hands. They were large hands, road-worn, with the particular stillness of hands that had been trained over decades to give nothing away. "I told you Silas Vane left Harlan Junction after Abner died. I told you I found him." He paused. "What I didn't tell you is what happened after." Calder waited. "Vane was not a simple man," Elias said. "He'd worked for Abner for 2 years, but he'd been working for someone else longer, someone who wanted certain land records to disappear. There were properties that Abner had documented, recorded legally, properly, that this other party needed unrecorded. So Vane went in after hours and killed Abner and took the records and made it look like a robbery." He stopped. "Except he made one mistake. He didn't take all the relevant documents. There were copies. In a second ledger Abner kept locked in a different location. Where are those documents now?" Elias looked at him. I have them, he said. I've had them for 2 years. The weight of that sat in the air between them. And you kept quiet, Calder said. I kept quiet. Elias said it without defense. Because Vane had a story ready. He had documents of his own, fabricated but plausible, that implicated someone else in Abner's death, someone whose name would carry weight with a marshal. He looked at Calder directly. Your name. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a thing clicking into place. Not a surprise exactly, because the shape of it had been forming in the back of his mind since the conversation at the Black Spur, but a confirmation, which is always worse than a surprise because it removes the last possibility that you were wrong. Vane put my name on it, Calder said. Not obviously, subtly. Documents suggesting you'd been hired to remove a problem. Your reputation made it believable. Nobody would question whether Calder Voss had killed a man, only whether he'd killed this particular one. Elias met his eyes steadily. I knew it wasn't true. I also knew the fabricated evidence would be found before my legitimate evidence, and that by the time the truth came out, if it came out, the damage to you would already be permanent. So you held your documents and stayed quiet. And handled Vane myself, Elias said quietly, which was a decision I've made peace with in the way you make peace with decisions that can't be unmade. Calder looked at him for a long time. He felt something moving through him that was not quite anger and not quite fear, something that belonged to the category of truths that rearranged the furniture of everything you thought you knew. His name, his reputation weaponized by someone he'd never met, pinned to a murder he'd had no part in, sitting in a file somewhere waiting to be found. Who else knows about these documents? He said. The man Vane was working for, Elias said. I don't know his full name. I have a partial one, and the properties he needed unrecorded, and the evidence trail from Abner's ledger. He paused. And I believe that man has been looking for me for 2 years. Which means, if he finds the connection to you, he'll use the fabricated evidence, Calder said. Yes. Calder sat with it. The station was quiet around them. Outside, the horses were settling for the night. Somewhere in the building he could hear the faint scratch of Mara's pen on paper, the small, ordinary sound of a woman working through a problem she was going to solve, because that was what she did. You should have told me in October, Calder said. In October you still had one hand on your gun, Elias said. And the man you were then would have ridden to Harlan Junction and handled it the way the old Calder Voss handled things. And it would have destroyed everything you're building here. He paused. I waited until you were the man who could hear it without doing that. Calder wanted to argue with the logic of it. He found, sitting there in the cold February light with the sound of Mara's pen in the background, that he couldn't. What do we do? He said. Nothing yet, Elias said. The documents are safe. The man looking for them doesn't know where I am. We have time, not unlimited time, but time. He looked at Calder steadily. But when it comes, and I believe it will come, we face it properly. Through a marshal. Through the law. All of it in the open. Not the way you handled Vane. Not the way I handled Vane, Elias said. That was my mistake to make. This has to be done right, because it's your name at stake, and a name that gets cleared wrong is not fully cleared. Calder was quiet for a long time. Then he said, All right. Elias nodded. They finished their coffee. The pen in the back room scratched on, steady and purposeful, and Calder listened to it and thought about documents in a locked ledger and a name that someone had borrowed without permission, and he thought about the fact that the life he was carefully building here was built on ground that had a crack running through it. He hadn't known about. He didn't tell Mara that night. He didn't know yet how to tell her in a way that was honest about the full shape of it, and he didn't want to say it wrong. She deserved the truth, and she deserved it whole, and whole took a little longer than he had tonight. He rode home in the dark with the cold on his face and the problem sitting in him like a stone in deep water, present, heavy, resting on the bottom, not going anywhere. He'd learned in the last 4 months to carry what couldn't be put down. He didn't like this particular weight, but he knew how to bear it now, which was something he hadn't known in October, and that, small as it seemed, was not nothing. He told Mara on a Saturday morning, 3 days after Elias's visit, because 3 days was as long as he could carry it without it showing. He hadn't planned the timing. He'd been in the yard checking the wagon axles before the Monday run when she came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without being asked, the way she'd started doing on cold mornings sometime in January, without either of them marking the moment it became a habit. She stood beside him with her own cup and looked at the wagon and said nothing, because she was good at the particular silence that meant she was waiting rather than absent. He told her. Not all of it at once. It came out in the order that it made sense to him, which meant starting with Elias and the night in October and what the old man had said about his brother, working forward through the conversation at the Black Spur in February, and ending with what Elias had told him Wednesday evening about the fabricated documents and the name that someone had attached to Abner Crowe's murder. She listened without interrupting. He'd learned that about her. She didn't fill silences with reassurance or questions while information was still coming. She waited until the full shape of a thing was visible before she responded to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known about the documents?" she said. 3 days. "And before that?" "About Elias's brother." "Since February, the broad outline." She looked at her coffee cup. "You waited." "I wanted to say it right," he said. "I didn't want to give you half of it." She was quiet again, and he couldn't fully read what was moving through her, whether it was anger at the delay or something more complicated, the kind of recalibration that happens when someone you thought you understood turns out to have a larger and more difficult context than you'd known. "Someone used your name to cover a murder," she said, flat, factual, getting the shape of it straight in her own mind. "Yes. And Elias has the evidence that clears you, and the evidence that shows who was behind it, or the beginning of that evidence, enough for a marshal to start with." She looked at him then, directly, the way she looked at problems she was deciding whether she could solve. "You're not going to run," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No." "Some men would." "I know." He held her eyes. "I'm not going to." She nodded once, the small definitive nod he'd come to recognize as her version of "all right, we proceed from here." "Then we need to talk about how to do this correctly," she said. "Because if there's a marshal involved and fabricated documents with your name on them, the way you walk into that situation matters." Elias said the same thing. "Elias is right." She set her cup on the wagon bed and crossed her arms. Not defensively. It was just where her arms went when she was thinking hard. "You go to a marshal with Elias's evidence before anyone else brings the fabricated version. You control the sequence. You don't let someone else tell the story first." He looked at her. "You're not asking me to explain myself more, or to—" "You told me the truth," she said. "You didn't have to, and you did. That's the relevant thing." A pause. "The rest of it, the reputation, the 18, all of it, I've known who you were since October. I made a decision about it then, and I haven't changed my mind." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, which was the right call. She picked up her cup. "Talk to Elias. Find out how solid the evidence is, and what a marshal would need to see. Then we figure out the next step." She looked at him steadily. "Together." He nodded. She went back inside. He stood in the yard with his coffee going cold and thought about the word together and how much weight a single word could carry when it was offered without conditions. The letter from the federal marshal's office arrived on a Tuesday in mid-March. It was addressed to Calder Voss, care of Rusk Freight and Transport, Redemption Flats territory, which meant someone had been specific about where to find him. It was signed by a Marshal Denton Ferris out of the regional office in Capwell, and it used the careful, formal language of official correspondence to say, in essence, "We need to speak with you regarding the death of one Abner Crowe, land agent, Harlan Junction, and the evidence pertaining thereto. Please present yourself at the earliest convenience. Failure to do so will result in a warrant for your detainment." Gideon read it over Calder's shoulder without comment. Mara read it second and handed it back. "He knows where you are," she said. "Someone told him," Calder said. "The man Vane was working for," Mara said, "or someone connected to him." She was doing the arithmetic the same way she did all arithmetic, fast, precise, mapping the connections. If he's been looking for Elias for 2 years and Elias came here and this letter arrives within a week, then someone is watching Elias, Calder said. The room was quiet for a moment. Gideon, who had been silent throughout, said, "Where is Crowe now?" "He moves," Calder said. "He was heading toward Sutter's Mill last I heard, but that was a week ago." "He needs to know about this letter," Mara said. "I know." Calder folded the letter and put it in his coat. "I'll find him, and then I'll go to Capwell." "We'll go to Capwell," Mara said. He looked at her. You're not walking into a marshal's office with a fabricated murder charge and no one who knows the full picture sitting beside you, she said. I know the documents. I know what Elias told you. If something goes wrong in that room, you need someone there who can speak to the sequence of events and hasn't spent 6 years building a reputation that makes everything harder to believe. He wanted to argue. He found he couldn't construct an argument that was better than hers. Your father needs you here, he said. My father managed this operation alone for 8 years before I came back, Gideon said from the doorway, with the tone of a man who has been waiting for someone to make this argument so he could end it. Go. Calder looked at him. Take care of this, Gideon said. Both of you. Come back. Finding Elias took 2 days. He was not at Sutter's Mill, but at a small way station 12 miles beyond it, traveling slowly and making no particular effort to hide, which told Calder that either the old man didn't know he was being watched or had decided the watching didn't change what he needed to do. When Calder showed him the letter, Elias read it twice. Then he folded it the same way Calder had folded it and handed it back, and sat with it for a moment. Ferris, he said. He's a reasonable man. I've had dealings with him before. Is that good? It means he'll look at evidence properly, Elias said. It also means he won't dismiss the fabricated documents just because we tell him they're fabricated. He'll want to verify everything. He paused. Which is correct. That's how it should work. Do you have everything you need? Calder said. The documents, the ledger, everything. It's secure, Elias said. I'll bring it. He looked at Calder for a long moment. There's something else I need to tell you. About the man behind this. Calder waited. His name, the part I've been able to establish, is Carver, Preston Carver. He has land interests across 4 territories, and the properties that Abner had legally recorded were standing between him and consolidation of a water rights claim worth considerably more than anything he'd have to spend to make the problem disappear. He paused. Abner wasn't the first person to inconvenience him. He was just the one I had reason to care about. Is Carver in this territory? He has representatives here, men who do his information gathering. Elias looked steady, but Calder could see the weight of it. 3 years of living with this, carrying it alone, making the decision to stay quiet, and then living inside that decision. I don't know how many. I don't know if the marshal's office has been contacted with the fabricated evidence yet, or whether that's still coming. Then we need to get to Ferris before Carver's men do, Mara said from beside Calder. She'd been listening without speaking, and now she laid it out with the same directness she applied to contract problems. If we're there first with your documents, Ferris processes ours before he sees theirs. Sequence matters. Elias looked at her. Something in his face shifted, the same shift Calder had seen when he first watched Mara handle a problem, the slight recalibration of a man updating his assessment. Yes, he said. Exactly. How far is Capwell? She said. 3 days at a good pace, Calder said. She nodded. Then we leave tomorrow morning. On. They rode out before sunrise. 3 days on the road had its own texture. Not pleasant exactly because the weather was still cold and the roads were soft with the late winter mud that made every mile take effort, but not unpleasant either. There was something clarifying about travel when the purpose of it was clear. You moved toward a thing, you managed the obstacles in front of you, you made camp when the light failed and started again when it returned. Elias rode well for a man his age, which didn't surprise Calder. The old man had the kind of physical economy that develops over decades, doing nothing unnecessary with his body, conserving energy the way a person does who has learned the hard way that reserves matter. Mara rode like someone who had grown up on this land and trusted it, which she had and did. On the second evening, camped on the lee side of a rise with a fire going and the horses picketed and the cold sitting around them at a respectful distance, Elias told them the rest of it. He told it the way he'd told pieces of it before, directly, without the performances of guilt or self-justification that would have made it easier to listen to and less honest. When he found Silas Vane, he said, Vane had been in a town 3 counties east living under a different name and working at a livery. He'd had the fabricated documents with him. He'd had Calder's name written into the forgery with enough plausible detail to carry weight, dates, a fictional meeting, a payment record that used actual places Calder had been known to frequent. Elias had confronted him. Vane had reached for a gun. Elias had been faster. He said it without drama. The way a man states something he's made peace with in the incomplete and provisional way that some things allow. I was a gunfighter for 20 years, he said. Vane wasn't. He made a decision, and it went the way it went. He looked at the fire. I took the documents. I kept the legitimate ones and destroyed the fabricated ones, or I thought I had. But Vane had clearly made copies before I found him, because the fabricated evidence exists somewhere, or Carver's people wouldn't be moving it toward a marshal now. Vane made a second set, Mara said. For insurance, Elias said, in case someone came for him. He paused. Which is what happened. He just hadn't accounted for who that someone would be. The fire cracked. The horses shifted. You should have come to me 2 years ago, Calder said. Not angrily. He'd worked through the anger in the 3 days since he'd first heard the full version. What was left was something more complicated and less hot. I know, Elias said. You made a decision that affected me without asking me. Yes. He looked at Calder directly, and I've thought about that every day since. The reasoning I had, that you weren't ready, that it would have sent you back into the life you'd just left. I believe it was true. And it was still my decision to make about your life, which wasn't mine to make. He paused. I'm sorry for it. It was a plain apology, no architecture around it, no justification attached, no softening, just the thing itself. Calder looked at him for a moment, then he looked at the fire. I know why you did it, he said. That doesn't mean it was right, but I understand it. That's more than I deserve, Elias said. Probably, Calder said. Mara said nothing. She was watching both of them with the careful attention of someone understanding a relationship she hadn't had full access to before. The particular dynamic of two men who had found each other at a specific and consequential moment and had been shaped by the finding in ways neither had fully articulated. After a while, she said, The fabricated evidence. What specifically does it say? Elias described it. She listened carefully, asking precise questions about dates and wording and what could be verified independently. She was building a counter-argument, Calder realized, working backward from the fabrication to find the places where it couldn't hold, where the facts it cited could be disproved by other facts, where the logic of it broke against what was actually true. By the time she finished asking questions, she had the shape of it. 3 of the dates he used are provable wrong, she said. I know where you were during 2 of them because of freight records. And the 3rd one, the supposed meeting in Harlan Junction, you were on the Parsley Creek Run. I have the manifest with the date. That was 4 months ago, Calder said, after Abner's death. The fabrication was made before you changed your life, she said. Vane was working from what your movements looked like before. He didn't update it. She looked at Elias. Combined with your documents, that's a significant hole in the forgery. Elias was looking at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something closer to genuine regard. You're very good at this, he said. I run contracts, she said simply. Discrepancies are the whole job. Capwell was a larger town than Redemption Flats by enough margin to feel like a different kind of place. Not a city, but substantial enough to have a federal marshal's office that looked like it had been built with the intention of permanence. 2 stories, solid construction, a sign that meant business. They arrived in the early afternoon of the 3rd day and went directly. Marshal Denton Ferris was in his 50s, lean, with a close-cropped gray beard, and the particular demeanor of a man who had spent decades being professionally skeptical and had gotten good at managing it without being unfair. He looked at Calder the way Calder expected, with recognition and the careful neutrality of a man who had a job to do and intended to do it, regardless of reputation. Mr. Voss, he said, I wasn't sure you'd come voluntarily. I didn't do what the documents will say I did, Calder said. Most people say that. I know. Calder held his eyes. That's why I brought the evidence. They spent 4 hours in Ferris's office. Elias laid out the legitimate documents, Abner's ledger copies, the correspondence trail, the land records, and the properties Carver needed disappeared, the connection to Vane, all of it in the careful sequence of a man who had been organizing this case in his head for 3 years and finally had a place to put it down. Mara presented the freight manifest with the dates and route records that contradicted the fabricated timeline. Calder answered every question Ferris asked, with the kind of directness that came from having nothing to hide in the specific area being examined, even while everything else about his history sat in the room as its own complicating presence. Ferris listened to all of it without interruption. Then he asked for an hour with the documents alone. They waited in the anteroom outside his office, Calder and Mara on one bench, Elias across from them, all three carrying the particular tension of people who have done everything they can and are now in the portion of the process that belongs to someone else. Mara's knee was touching Calder's. Neither of them moved away. Elias was looking at his hands. "Elias," Mara said quietly. He looked up. "After this," she said, "when it's settled, what will you do?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I have unfinished business in 3 or 4 places," he said. "Things I've been putting off because of this." He paused. "Things I should have settled a long time ago. Some of them don't have clean resolutions, but I'll go and make what peace I can." "That sounds lonely," she said. Something moved through his face. "It is," he said simply. "It's been lonely for a long time." He looked at Calder and then at Mara, and something in his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite grief, something that lived at the border between them. "But this," he gestured slightly, meaning the room, the 3 of them, what they'd built over the past 4 hours and the months before it. "This helps." Ferris called them back in after 90 minutes, not 60. He sat behind his desk with the documents arranged in front of him and looked at all 3 of them for a moment before he spoke. "The legitimate documents are solid," he said. "The provenance is clear, the record trail is coherent, and the cross-references with the land registry are verifiable." He paused. "The fabricated evidence I've seen a version of. It came to this office 3 weeks ago through an intermediary who claimed to represent a private citizen with concerns about an unsolved murder." Calder felt Mara's knee press slightly against his. "The fabrication has 3 date discrepancies that I can identify now from what you've shown me," Ferris continued. "That's enough to categorize it as suspect. Combined with what Mr. Crowe has provided, I have grounds to investigate the source of the fabrication rather than its subject." He looked at Calder directly. "You are not a suspect in the death of Abner Crowe, Mr. Voss. You are a witness to a pattern of evidence tampering." The air in the room changed, not dramatically. There was no flood of relief, no sudden lightness. Just a shift, the way a room changes when a window is open that's been closed too long. Something loosened that had been held tight for so long, Calder had stopped noticing it was tight. "Preston Carver," Ferris said. "This is the 2nd time that name has appeared in connection with irregular land dealings in this region. It will not be the last time I hear it, I suspect." He looked at Elias. "Your brother's death will be formally reopened as an investigation, Mr. Crowe. I want you available to this office." "I'll be available," Elias said. His voice was controlled. His hands on his knees were not entirely. "And you," Ferris said to Calder, "I want a full deposition. Everything you can provide about what you knew and when, who told you, the sequence. All of it." He paused. "There will also be questions about your prior history that are outside my jurisdiction here, but you should expect that other offices may want to speak with you as that record is comprehensive." "I know," Calder said. "I'll answer whatever's asked." Ferris looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of a man revising a category. "You didn't have to come voluntarily," he said. "No," Calder agreed. "I've been doing this for 23 years, Ferris said. Guilty men don't usually bring their own counter-evidence." He stood. "We'll start the deposition tomorrow morning. I'd ask you to remain in Capwell through the end of the week." "We'll stay," Mara said. Ferris looked at her, the same slight adjustment that men who weren't paying attention always had to make when they realized who in a room was actually managing the situation. "And you are Mara Rusk," she said. "I provided the freight records. I'll be available for questions as well." "Good," Ferris said, and there was something in his voice that was closer to respect than courtesy. They stayed 4 days in Capwell. The deposition took 2 full days, not because Calder was being difficult, but because Ferris was thorough, and thorough took time. He asked about everything: Elias, the conversation in October at the Black Spur, the sequence of what he'd learned and when, the Rusk station, the months of work, the Von Mercer incidents, all of it. Calder answered all of it. There was no version of the deposition that didn't include the full history, the 18, the years before Redemption Flats, the life he'd been when Elias Crowe had looked at him across a table and seen something worth interrupting his reading to address. He told it straight. All of it. Ferris listened without judgment and with the specific attention of a man building a complete picture, and by the end of the second day, Calder felt something he hadn't expected, a kind of tired relief at having said the whole of it out loud, in a room with the official standing, to a person whose job it was to hear it and decide what it meant. He couldn't undo any of it, but he could stop carrying it in the dark. Elias gave his deposition on the third day. Calder wasn't in the room for most of it. Ferris wanted witnesses separate, but he saw the old man afterward, in the late afternoon light outside the marshal's office, and Elias looked like a man who had put down a very heavy thing and was learning what his body felt like without it. They didn't talk much that evening. They didn't need to. On the fourth morning, Ferris met with all three of them briefly. "Carver's being investigated," he said. "That's a federal matter now, above my office. What I can tell you is that the evidence from Mr. Crowe has been forwarded to the appropriate authority, and your names are attached to it as cooperative witnesses, not suspects." He looked at Calder. "Your clearance in the Abner Crowe case will be formally documented. That documentation will be on record." "Thank you," Calder said. "Don't thank me," Ferris said. "You did the work. I just have the desk. Us." They rode home on a Thursday. The road back was different from the road out, the same landscape, the same late winter cold, but the interior of it was different in the way that a road you've traveled looks different when you know where it ends. Elias rode with them as far as the turnoff toward the eastern settlements, where his own path diverged. He stopped at the fork and sat his horse and looked at Calder and Mara for a moment without speaking first, which was his way. "You did this right," he said finally. "We did it the way you said," Calder said. "Through the law. All of it in the open." "I know." Elias paused. "I should have done it that way with Vane." He looked at Calder directly. "I want you to know I'm aware of that. Not as an excuse, just, I want you to know I see it clearly." "I know you do," Calder said. Elias looked at Mara. "Take care of him," he said, "and make sure he takes care of you." "That's the arrangement," she said. Something in Elias's face did what it did when he was close to an emotion he kept carefully managed, a slight softening around the eyes, a brief relaxation of the jaw. "Good," he said. He turned his horse toward the eastern road. "Elias," Calder said. The old man looked back. "Come through Redemption Flats," Calder said. "When you're done with the unfinished business. Come through and stay a while." Elias looked at him for a long moment. "I might," he said. He rode east. Calder and Mara watched him go, the old man on the gray horse with the blaze, moving at his unhurried pace, getting smaller against the pale March sky. "He'll come," Mara said. "Maybe," Calder said. "He will." She looked at him sideways, the look she gave things she'd already decided. "He doesn't have as much unfinished business as he thinks. The finished part was here." Calder thought about that. He thought about October, and a corner table, and a book, and a man who hadn't flinched. He thought about what it costs to find the right person at the right moment, and what it means to be that person for someone else, and how rarely anyone understands which of those things is happening while it's happening. "Maybe you're right," he said. She turned her horse back toward the road south. "I usually am," she said. He followed her. Behind them, the fork in the road sat quiet in the morning light, and the hoofprints of 3 horses pointed in 3 directions, and the landscape did what it always did, absorbed it all without comment, and went on. They arrived back at the station on a Friday evening, just as the light was going flat and orange across the yard. Gideon was at the corral fence when they rode in, doing something with a gate latch that had been giving trouble for a week. He looked up when he heard the horses. He didn't say anything right away. He took in the fact of both of them returning, the particular quality of how they were sitting their horses, the absence of the specific tension that had been present when they'd ridden out 4 days ago. Then he said, "Well." "It's handled," Calder said. Gideon looked at him for a moment, then at Mara. Then he went back to the gate latch. "Good," he said. "Supper's keeping warm. Hector made something. I don't know what it is, but there's a lot of it." That was the homecoming. No ceremony, no extended recounting of events, no moment of recognition that lasted longer than it needed to. Gideon was not a man who marked things with speeches, and Calder had learned over the months to read his economy of expression as a form of respect rather than indifference. The gate latch was real and present and needed fixing. The fact that they'd come back, whole, the thing handled, was real and present and noted. Both things were true at the same time, and both got the same quality of attention, which was Gideon's way of saying that Calder belonged to this place in the same category as the gate latch, part of the inventory of things worth maintaining. He put up the horses. Mara went inside. By the time he came in from the corral, she was already at the table with the ledger open, doing the week's reconciliation that she'd missed while they were in Capwell, because Mara Rusk did not let things accumulate if she could prevent it. He sat down across from her. She didn't look up. "Eat something," she said. "Hector's whatever it is actually not bad." He ate. It was a beef stew with more pepper than was strictly necessary, and a biscuit that had the texture of something that had been kept warm too long, which is to say it was imperfect and filling and exactly what it was supposed to be. He ate it and watched her work and thought, this is what I came back to. Not an abstraction of safety or normalcy or belonging, this specific table, this specific woman frowning at a column of numbers, this specific smell of wood smoke and horse and coffee that had been sitting too long. This. The ordinary, particular texture of it. He thought about something Elias had said on the road to Capwell, and the way conversations surface themselves sometimes at a delay, when the moment is quiet enough to hear them properly. When you've only ever been one thing to people, being something else feels almost dishonest at first, like you're pretending. But if you do it long enough, it stops being pretend. He was not pretending anymore. I wasn't sure exactly when the line had been crossed, whether it was a moment or a gradual thing that happened the way seasons change, without a specific day you could point to. But he was on the other side of it. The man who had walked into the Black Spur in October with his hand always near his holster, and his reputation walking in 3 seconds ahead of him, was not the man sitting at this table eating Hector's overseasoned stew. I was still Calder Voss. The history didn't disappear because the direction changed, but he was also this. Freight routes and contract disputes and cold mornings, and a woman who argued with him about axle weights and meant it. Both things were true. He was learning to let them be. The formal documentation from Marshal Ferris's office arrived in the first week of April, a sealed letter on official paper that stated, in the precise language of federal record-keeping, that Calder Voss was cleared of any involvement in the death of Abner Crowe, that the case had been reopened as a homicide investigation with identified suspects, and that evidence of fabrication had been referred to the appropriate authority for action. He read it once. Then he folded it and put it in the lockbox where Mara kept the station's important papers, which felt like the right place for it. Not displayed, not destroyed, just filed alongside the contracts and the manifests and the route records, part of the documentary record of what the station was and how it had come to be what it was. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel when he'd imagined this moment, back in February when Elias had first told him the shape of the problem. He'd imagined something larger, relief with real weight to it, or a kind of vindication that had a sound to it. What he felt instead was quieter and harder to name. Something like, the last thing that needed to be addressed has been addressed. Not an end. More like a knot untied. The rope was the same rope, but now it could run free. Mara read the letter after him and set it in the lockbox herself. "Carver," she said, "will Ferris actually reach him?" "Ferris said it's a federal matter now," Calder said. "Above his office. He doesn't control the timeline." "But the evidence is solid." "The evidence is solid," he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone running the odds. "Men like Carver have money, and lawyers, and patience," she said. "It might take years." "Yes." "And he might find ways to delay or complicate." "Yes," Calder said. "But the record is made. Abner Crowe's files are on record now. The properties are documented. Carver can't undocument them." He paused. "And Elias has copies of everything in a second location that Ferris knows about. Carver can't reach all of it." She accepted this with a small nod. Not satisfied exactly. She was too precise to be satisfied by partial outcomes, but acknowledging the shape of what was possible. "It's the best we could do," she said. "It is," he said. She closed the lockbox. Okay. Spring came to the territory the way it always did on the high plains, reluctantly at first, a few warm days followed by a cold snap that felt personal, and then all at once, as if the land had been holding its breath, and finally exhaled. The Kendrick timber contract came through in the second week of April. Mara had been negotiating with Edmund Kendrick for 6 weeks, a patient, precise back and forth that she'd handled almost entirely by correspondence, with one in-person meeting at the station that Calder had attended in the same capacity as the Patterson brothers meeting, present, available for specific questions, otherwise letting her run the room. Kendrick was a self-made man in his late 40s who had built his timber operation from 2 axes and a mule team into a significant regional enterprise, and he respected competence in others the way people who've built things from scratch tend to, practically, without sentiment. He'd addressed his questions to Mara by the end of the first hour. The contract was a 6-month trial with an option to extend through the following year if performance met the agreed benchmarks. It required 2 dedicated wagons and a minimum 4-horse team on the primary route, with a secondary run to the Parsley Creek settlement twice monthly. It was more work than the station had ever taken on at one commitment, and it required the equipment expansion that Mara had been carefully planning for since February. Gideon got the loan. He came back from the bank in Capwell, a separate trip from the marshal's visit made in early April, with a figure that made the corners of his mouth tighten in the way of a man who has agreed to something that is reasonable and still costs more than he wishes it did. He spread the bank papers on the work table and looked at Mara's route projections and the revenue estimates she'd built from the Kendrick terms, and did his own arithmetic, the slow, careful kind. And then he looked up and said, "We need to be profitable by August." "We'll be profitable by June," Mara said. He looked at her. "The Patterson contracts carry us through May," she said. "Kendrick starts April 15th. The secondary Parsley Creek run adds margin. If we run the primary route efficiently and don't take losses on weather delays." She showed him the column. June. Gideon studied the numbers for a long time. "What if the weather doesn't cooperate?" "Then July," she said, "but not August." He folded the bank papers. "All right," he said. "We do it." The new wagon arrived from the manufacturer in Harlan Junction in the 3rd week of April, which meant 2 solid days of Calder and Hector going over every fitting and joint and wheel and axle with the thoroughness of people who knew that equipment failure on a timber run was not an inconvenient problem, but a catastrophic one. They found 3 things that needed adjustment before the wagon was work-ready, which was par for the course with new equipment and also the reason you checked. Calder ran the primary Kendrick route himself for the first 3 weeks. Sycamore Fork was not a simple road. He'd said that to Mara back in January, and he'd meant it. The grade coming out of the mill added strain to any load, and the road had 2 creek crossings that were manageable in dry weather and required specific technique in wet, and the timing of the mill's loading schedule meant an early start on run days to make the settlements before dark. But the road was also, in the way of difficult roads, clarifying. He drove it and learned it and came to know its specific demands the way you come to know the demands of anything that requires consistent attention. Not with affection exactly, but with the particular respect that competence builds toward its subject matter. By the 4th week, he had a route rhythm that shaved 40 minutes off the original estimate, and he wrote the adjustments into the dispatch schedule in the careful handwriting he'd been practicing because his original handwriting had been nearly illegible, and Mara had told him so directly in February. She'd been right. She usually was. Hector left in May. He got an offer from a larger freight operation out of Dalton County. Better pay, more established routes, the kind of opportunity that a man in his position couldn't reasonably turn down, and he didn't. He told Gideon on a Thursday and was gone by the following Monday, which was the nature of frontier employment. People came and went according to their own calculations, and the calculations didn't always include sentiment about the place they were leaving. Calder shook his hand the morning he rode out. "You were fair," Hector said, which, from Hector, was approximately the highest available compliment. "So were you," Calder said. He watched the big man ride out of the yard and then went back to work, because there was always work, and because one man leaving meant the remaining men absorbed his share until a replacement could be found. There were 3 in the yard now: Calder, a quiet young man named Tobias who joined them in March, and an older teamster named Prentice who showed up when he wasn't on his own private schedule, which was about 4 days out of 6, and knew more about horses than almost anyone Calder had encountered. They found someone to replace Hector by mid-May. A woman, actually, which was not unheard of on the frontier but was unusual enough that Prentice spent the first 2 days working out what to do with his face about it. Her name was June Aldrich, She was 31. She'd been running supply wagons for a mining operation that had shut down. And she loaded a wagon faster than any of the men and drove a 4-horse team like she'd been born holding the reins. Mara hired her after a 15-minute conversation. When Prentice made a sideways comment about it in the yard, Calder looked at him and said, "She can load faster than you." Prentice was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said, with the honesty of a man who decides facts are facts. He went back to work. June Aldrich fit into the station the way competent people fit into good operations, smoothly, without ceremony, as though the space for her had already been there and she'd simply stepped into it. The letter from Elias came in early June. He wrote the way he talked, direct, without excess, giving information in the order it was needed. He was in the Southern Territories, he wrote. He had settled 2 of the items of unfinished business he'd described on the road. One had resolved better than he'd expected. One had not resolved at all, and he had made peace with the fact that some things didn't. He was well. He asked about the station and said without saying it directly that he was glad the Capwell matter had been handled the way it had been. The last paragraph said, "I'll come through Redemption Flats before winter. I told you I might. I've decided I will." Calder showed it to Mara over coffee. She read it and handed it back. "Good," she said. "You were right," he said, "about him finishing." "I usually am," she said, which was the same thing she'd said on the road home from Capwell, and she said it the same way, not as a boast, just as a fact she'd observed about herself and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He thought about the old man somewhere in the Southern Territories, making peace with things that had been unsettled too long, and he felt something for him that was simpler and steadier than most of what he'd felt in October. Not pity, which would have been wrong, and not admiration exactly, though that was in it. More like gratitude for the specific accident of ending up in the same saloon on the same October evening, and for whatever in Elias had decided the interruption was worth making. Most people walk past the corner table. Elias Crowe hadn't. On a Thursday evening in the middle of June, Calder went to see Gideon. He found him where he usually was at that hour, in the main building going over the week's tallies, with his coffee at his elbow going cold the way it always did, because Gideon got absorbed in numbers and forgot to drink it. He looked up when Calder came in. Calder sat down across from him. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Gideon set down his pencil. He didn't say anything, which meant he was listening. "I want to stay," Calder said. "Not as a hired man, as a partner." He kept his eyes on Gideon's face. "I know that's a different conversation than the one we've been having, and I know you might have reasons to say no, but I'm asking." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee, then at the ledger, then at Calder. "A partner," he said. "I can put in capital," Calder said. "I've been saving since October. It's not a large amount, but it's real. And I can run routes that nobody else here can run. Not because I'm particularly special, but because of things I know about roads and teams and managing difficult conditions." He paused. "And I think this operation is worth building." "Because of Mara," Gideon said. It was direct. It deserved a direct answer. "That's part of it," Calder said. "I won't pretend it isn't, but if it were only that I'd have said something different. I'm asking to be a partner in the business because I believe in the business." He held the older man's eyes. "The other thing, Mara is her own person, and she makes her own decisions. I know that. You know that better than anyone." Gideon looked at him for a long time. He had the face of a man running a calculation that was more complicated than arithmetic, the kind of assessment that includes things like, what does this man's history tell me about his character? And does the chapter he's written here match the chapters that came before it? And what does my daughter's face look like when this man is in the room versus when he isn't? He had been observing all of this for 8 months. "You're asking me 2 different things," Gideon said finally. "I know," Calder said. "The business question I can answer," Gideon said. "It's yes, you've earned it, and the station needs it, and the numbers support it." He paused. "The other question isn't mine to answer." "I know that too," Calder said. "Then you know what you need to do next," Gideon said. He picked up his pencil and looked at the ledger. "Close the door on your way out." He found Mara at her desk, which was where she was most evenings after supper. Not because she was a person who couldn't stop working, but because her desk was where she thought, and she was almost always thinking about something. She looked up when he came in. He sat down in the chair across from her, the same chair he'd been sitting in on Friday mornings for 6 months, the chair that had become, without ceremony or announcement, his chair in this room. "I talked to your father," he said. She set her pencil down. Her face was the careful, present face of a person paying full attention. "I asked him about a partnership in the station," Calder said. He said yes. She looked at him steadily. And I'm asking you something different," he said. He held her eyes. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm not going to try to be. But I want you to know what I'm asking and why." "Then say it," she said. "I'm asking if you'll marry me," he said. "Not because of the station, and not because of the months, and not because you already know how I think. Because I want to be the person you choose, specifically." He paused. "If you choose me." The room was quiet. She looked at him for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. Mara processing, assembling, deciding, the way she did everything. "You drove that Parsley Creek Road in a sleet storm in January," she said. He wasn't sure where this was going. "Yes." "You came back with the load intact and the team sound, and you didn't mention it until I asked why the delivery was an hour late." She looked at him. "You said the conditions were difficult. That was all you said." "It was," he said. "I know it was," she said. "Prentice told me what difficult meant in that case." She held his eyes. "I decided something that day. I didn't say it because it wasn't the right time, and I'm not a person who says things before it's time." She paused. "It's time." "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. She reached across the desk and took his hand. Not the gesture of a person overcome by emotion, but the deliberate, conscious gesture of a person making a decision physical. Her hand was warm and work-roughened and held his with the kind of grip that said, "I've thought about this, and I mean it." "I'm not easy," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'll argue with you about root decisions, and I'll correct you when you're wrong, and I'll have weeks where the books are more important than conversation." "I know," he said. "And you're not simple either," she said. "You carry things. You'll carry the 18 for the rest of your life, and I know that, and it's part of what I'm saying yes to." She held his eyes. "I'm not choosing the man the legend made. I'm choosing the man who turned his back on Vaughn Mercer and walked inside and drank bad coffee and went back to work. That's the man I'm saying yes to." He looked at her for a moment. "That man," he said, "has been trying to be worth choosing." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm choosing him." They married in August. Not a large wedding. The frontier didn't accommodate elaborate productions, and neither Mara nor Calder were people who wanted them. There was a justice of the peace from Capwell who made the 2-day ride out for the occasion, and there were the people from the station, Prentice, Tobias, June Aldrich, who had by August become simply June and part of the fabric of the place, and there were the Rusk family connections Gideon had in the territory, a small collection of people who had known Mara since she was young, and who looked at Calder with the careful attention of people determining whether someone is good enough for a person they love. Calder met their attention directly. He didn't explain himself or perform. He was simply present, which was by now his natural mode rather than a practiced one. The ceremony was short and honest, vows without excess. The justice of the peace read what he read and asked what he asked, and Mara and Calder answered what was asked, and it was done. Gideon shook Calder's hand after with both hands, which was the most demonstrative thing Calder had ever seen him do. "Welcome home," Gideon said. "Just that." Calder nodded. He didn't have a speech for it. He thought Gideon probably understood that and was not expecting one. Well, Elias came through Redemption Flats in October. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the same month it had been a year before when Calder had ridden into the Black Spur and sat across from an old man reading in a corner. The symmetry of it was not lost on either of them, though neither mentioned it directly, because neither was given to that kind of explicit reflection. He stayed for 5 days. He helped in the yard when there was work and sat out of the way when there wasn't. He ate his meals at the station table and talked, in the evenings, with the ease that Calder hadn't seen in him before. The ease of a man who has set down the specific weights he'd been carrying and is still adjusting to the difference in his own body. He wasn't light. He wasn't at peace in the uncomplicated way the word implies, but he was present in a way he hadn't been in October, or in February, or on the road to Capwell. He told them, on the third evening, that the Carver investigation had moved forward. A federal agent had contacted him in August, followed the paper trail from Ferris's office to the second location where Elias had kept the document copies. There had been a lengthy conversation. Elias had turned over everything. The agent had been specific about the fact that the case was now officially an active federal investigation and that Carver's land interests across 4 territories were under scrutiny. "Will it stick?" Calder said. "The evidence is solid," Elias said. "Whether it sticks depends on lawyers and time and the particular patience of the people bringing it." He paused. "But the record is made. Abner is in the record now. His work, his documentation, what it cost him. That part is permanent." Mara looked at him. "That's what you needed," she said, "for it to be in the record." Elias looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's what I needed." On his 4th evening, when Mara had gone to finish some work and Gideon had turned in early, Elias and Calder sat in the main building with the fire going and the October dark outside the windows, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the quiet of 2 people who have earned it. "You look different again," Elias said. "You said that in February. It's still true." He looked at him steadily. "You look like a man who knows where he is." Calder considered this. "I know where I am," he said. "That took longer than it sounds," Elias said. "Yes," Calder said. "It did." Elias looked at the fire for a moment. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly so there's no question about what I mean." Calder waited. "What you did?" "Walking away from it," Elias said. "Not just in the saloon in October, all of it. Mercer, the reputation, the entire structure of what you'd built. Walking away from that when it was the only thing that had ever made you feel like something." He stopped for a moment. "Most men can't do that." "I know. No, I tried and failed more times than I can count before it finally held." He looked at Calder directly. "What you did took more courage than any of the 18. Calder was quiet for a long time. He thought about courage and what that word actually contained. Not the Hollywood version of it, not the frontier version that equated it exclusively with being willing to pull a trigger, but the real and unglamorous version that he'd been living inside for 12 months. The courage of sitting still when every instinct said move. The courage of turning your back on an armed man and walking. The courage of choosing, day after day, to be something you weren't sure you were yet, without any guarantee that the choosing would eventually make it true. "I'm not sure it was courage," he said. "I think I was just tired." "That's usually where courage actually comes from," Elias said. "Not from strength, from exhaustion with what you've been doing." Calder looked at the fire. He thought about something he'd been turning over for months, something he couldn't have said in October because he hadn't had the words for it yet, and maybe couldn't have said in February or March either, because some truths need more time in the making. "I thought for a long time," he said slowly, "that who I was, the gun, the reputation, all of it, that was the realest version of me, the most honest one, because it came naturally, because I was good at it." He paused. "But that's backwards. A thing being natural doesn't make it true. It just makes it easy." Elias was very still. "The hardest version was the real one," Calder said. "This, the work, learning to be useful instead of frightening, learning to let someone argue with me about axle weights and be right." He shook his head slightly. "The easiest thing I ever did was pull a trigger. The hardest thing I ever did was put the gun in a drawer and leave it there." Elias looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That's it exactly." They sat with it. The fire popped. Outside, the horses shifted in the corral, the same sound they made every night, steady and unremarkable. "Elias," Calder said. "Stay through winter." The old man looked at him. "You said you had places to be," Calder said. "I'm not arguing with that. But winter's coming and the unfinished business is as finished as it's going to be for now. Stay through winter. Help with the Kendrick roots. The grade at Sycamore Fork gets worse in the snow, and I could use someone who knows road conditions." He paused. "And Mara makes better coffee than the boarding house in town." Elias looked at him for a long moment. "That last part is doing most of the work in that argument," he said. "I know," Calder said. Elias looked at the fire. He was quiet long enough that Calder thought he might say no, might cite the places he needed to be, the things he hadn't yet addressed, the particular solitude of a man who has lived alone with his choices long enough that company feels like a disruption even when it doesn't. Through winter, Elias said finally. Through winter, Calder confirmed. Elias picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. It is good coffee, he said. I know, Calder said. The Colt sat in the bottom drawer of the small chest beside the bed. Not hidden, Calder hadn't hidden it, hadn't wrapped it or locked it away, or made a ceremony of putting it somewhere inaccessible. It was simply there, in the drawer, the way things that have been part of your life continue to exist without defining it. He knew it was there. On occasion, he was aware of it in the particular way you're aware of old injuries, not with pain, but with a quiet recognition of its presence in the inventory of your body and your history. He hadn't touched it since the night he'd arrived in Redemption Flats, when he'd emptied his saddlebag and placed it there with the same absence of ceremony with which he now left it. Mara knew it was there. She'd asked him about it once, early on, in March, when the Capwell matter was still unsettled and the question of whether his past would catch up to the present was still genuinely open. She'd asked if he needed it accessible. He'd said, I need it where I put it. She'd accepted that, because Mara Rusk understood the difference between a man maintaining a safeguard and a man who hadn't actually let go of something, and she'd trusted him to know which one he was doing. That trust had meant more than she'd probably known at the time. The frontier still had violence in it. That hadn't changed and wasn't going to. Men still wore guns into the Black Spur, and the occasional shot still cracked the quiet on a Saturday night in town, and the territory still had its share of people who resolved disputes at the point of a barrel because they hadn't found any other way. Calder understood all of that, and it didn't move him. He was not naive about what the world was. He'd seen more of its worst operations than most people saw in 3 lifetimes. It wasn't operating from ignorance of the violence or from a fantasy that refusing to participate in it made it disappear. He was operating from a choice, a plain, daily, unglamorous choice that he made every morning when he got up and went out to the yard and started the work. The drawer stayed closed. On a November morning, with the first real cold of the season coming down from the north and the light going thin and pale. Over the Sycamore Fork Road, Calder was in the yard hitching the team for the week's timber run when Mara came out of the building with her coat on and a manifest in her hand. She stopped next to him and looked at the team with the assessing eyes she gave any logistical situation. Prentice says the North Crossing might have ice, she said. I know, he said. I'm taking it slow. The Kendrick delivery window is tight. I know that too. He checked the near leader's collar fit and adjusted it by a 1/4 inch. I'll make it. She looked at him sideways. I know what I'm doing, he said. I know you do, she said. I'm just... She stopped, looked away briefly. Then, be careful. It was a simple thing to say. She didn't say it often. Mara was not given to the performances of worry, and she had enough confidence in his competence that caution flags were usually reserved for genuinely elevated risk. When she said it, she meant it specifically. He looked at her. I'll be careful, he said. She handed him the manifest. Their hands touched in the exchange, briefly, the contact of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that even small physical moments carry a specific weight. She went back inside. He climbed up to the wagon box and took the reins and looked out at the road ahead. The pale November sky, the frost on the fence post, the long, particular emptiness of the high plains in the cold season, which was not really emptiness but a fullness of a different kind. All the small and silent things that were alive in it, that you only noticed when the louder things had gone quiet. He thought about something he'd been thinking about in pieces for months, without assembling it quite this clearly until now. There's a story people tell about the frontier, about what makes a man, about what courage looks like, about what it means to be worth something in a hard place. It's a story with guns in it, and speed, and the willingness to make yourself terrifying. And there's something true in it, or there was once, or it was true for a specific kind of survival in a specific kind of circumstance. He didn't argue with the history of it, but the story was wrong about the hardest part. The hardest part wasn't the draw. The hardest part wasn't the reputation or the fear in other people's eyes, or the thing you became when you learned you were capable of something most people only talked about. The hardest part was the morning after, and the morning after that, The accumulation of mornings in which you could either keep being the thing you were or try to figure out what else was in you. And the figuring out was slow and painful and didn't have a dramatic moment to mark it. No showdown, no final shot, no clean resolution. Just, who are you going to be today? Tomorrow. In the cold, at the table, with this woman who argues with you about axle weights and is right more often than you'd like. The hardest thing Calder Voss had ever done was not become the fastest gun alive. The hardest thing was decide he didn't need to be anymore. He clicked his tongue at the team, and they moved out of the yard and onto the road, the wagon rolling with its load behind him, steady and real and requiring attention. The Sycamore Fork Road opened ahead of him with its particular demands. The grade, the crossings, the timing, all of it concrete, immediate, his. He drove. The station shrank behind him until it was just the shape of a building and a corral fence against the pale sky. And then it disappeared behind the first rise in the road, and he was alone with the team in the cold and the empty miles ahead. But alone felt different now than it used to. Before, alone had been his natural state. Not chosen, just arrived at, the way you arrive at a condition you've been heading toward without realizing. The isolation of a man defined by something that other people couldn't share, that put a glass wall between him and the ordinary world, that made him legible only as a threat or a legend and not as a person who got cold on November mornings and made mistakes and needed to be corrected about axle weights. Now alone was just the space between leaving one place and arriving at another. It had a duration and a destination and people at both ends of it who knew where he was and expected him to come back. That was the whole difference. It was not a small difference. He thought about the 18. He always would. That was the arithmetic Elias had described, and it was accurate. They were there. They would always be there. He was not a man who'd found a way to put down what he'd done, and he'd stopped expecting to. What he'd found instead was something more honest and less comfortable. The knowledge that what you've done is not the same as what you are. That a life is not its worst chapters. That the only direction available is forward, and forward doesn't require you to forget the distance you've covered to get here. It only requires you to keep moving. He had 18 behind him. And ahead of him, he had a timber delivery and a north crossing that might have ice and a road that demanded his full attention, and a station he'd come back to tonight where Mara would want to know the condition of the crossing so she could adjust the next run schedule, and Elias would be in the yard doing something useful, and Gideon would have the books ready for their Friday review. Ordinary. Specific. His. He was Calder, not the gunfighter, not the legend, not the warning story parents told their children, or the name that arrived 3 seconds before the man did. Not the 18, not the reputation, just Calder. It had taken him 12 months and one old man reading in a corner and one woman who argued with him and one drawer that stayed closed to find out that this was the version of himself that had always been underneath the other one, waiting with the patience of something that knows it can't be rushed. He was not a perfect man. He would make mistakes. He'd already made them here. He'd make more, and Mara would point them out, and Gideon would note them in the way Gideon noted everything, and Elias would say something direct and true about them that Calder wouldn't always want to hear. He was not a finished man either. He was a man in the middle of a life, on a cold November road, with a team that needed managing and a load that needed delivering and a home that was waiting for him at the end of the day. That was enough. That was, he had come to understand, exactly enough. The road curved left around the base of the first hill and straightened out toward the north crossing, and Calder felt the cold on his face and the reins in his hands and the solid weight of the wagon behind him, and he drove toward what was ahead of him with the full attention of a man who had finally, after considerable difficulty and not a little damage, decided that what was ahead of him was worth arriving at.